There's a door in front of you and a light on the other side of it. You don't remember how you got here. You remember the ship, the hum of something enormous, and then nothing. Above the doorway, a panel of numbers spins fast like a slot machine, deciding who you're about to become. You step through and the numbers freeze. Now you're standing on the edge of a city that you've never seen before. Stone walls, torchlight, the smell of rain about to fall. Somewhere behind you, a smith is hammering something on an anvil in perfect time with the music drifting out of a tavern down the street. Nobody tells you why you're here. Nobody hands you a quest, a sword, or a reason. You're just cold, a little hungry, and very, very far from home. This city doesn't pause for you. The sun will set whether you're ready or not, and when it does, the rain will come, and something worse than rain will come with it. So find shelter, find a coin, and find out who you are now, one choice at a time. Join us as we step through the portal into a city that never stops moving on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 307th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. We'll tell you each story. We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, a little obscure, we are looking back at Alternate Reality, The City, the 1985 Atari 8-bit role-playing game from a self-taught programmer who reversed engineered his own hardware from a shack in the Hawaiian backwoods. That's a lot. Developed by Philip Price and Gary Gilbertson under the name Paradise Programming, it was meant to be the first chapter of a 6 or 7 game series, an entire argument about captivity and free will and what's actually real, told across a world that got colder and hungrier and more dangerous, whether you're ready for it or not. Also didn't end up with Paradise Programming. It ended up in like 3 or 4 different companies. This one's wild. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who I have no doubt would spend his first week in Xebec's Demise doing absolutely nothing productive, forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep, and somehow still finding a way to get mugged by a gremlin. He is, of course, my brother Rob Casson. Rob, be honest, in a city that is tracking your every move and quietly deciding whether you're good or evil, how long do you last before the guards are after you?
Well, Dave, I still haven't been arrested, so I'll get back to you on that.
I feel like that's a great question, not just for this game, but like Skyrim, which we put countless hours into, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair.
Have you ever been arrested in Skyrim?
Oh, absolutely.
See? I knew it. Evil. I knew it. Been saying that the whole time.
I was stealing food.
I was
Is that
stealing
evil,
wood.
or was I just trying to survive?
Oh, God. One of those.
Exactly.
I was just stealing anything I could get my hands on.
Well, some do it for the love of the game, some do it for the love of life.
Some do it for food. All right. Well, we have a tale to tell today. Really interesting game, really obscure. But before we get to it, why don't you take some time and share with our listeners what else has happened during this week in gaming history?
Sure thing, Dave. Kicking it off on July 14th, 1993, Super Mario All-Stars was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, developed and published by none other than Nintendo. The compilation gathered Super Mario Bros., The Lost Levels, Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario Bros. 3, rebuilt with 16-bit graphics and a save feature, at the suggestion of Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto himself. It marked the first time the Lost levels, originally deemed too difficult for release outside of Japan on the NES, would reach Western audiences at all. Critics praised the updated visuals and music while criticizing the lack of anything genuinely new. But the compilation went on to sell over 10.5 million copies and became something of a template for how Nintendo would handle its own back catalog for decades afterwards.
What's funny about the Lost Levels is that literally they took the original Mario, they handed it off to Tezuka, and Tezuka was like, "I'm just gonna make Mario, but hard, like really hard," because in his mind, gamers wanted to be challenged. That was what they would expect out of a sequel, was just to be challenged even more. And so that's literally what he did. He made a super hard Super Mario Brothers. And then they thought it was going to be too hard for Western audiences, so we got Super Mario Brothers 2 and yada yada yada. So, fun stuff.
Well, wasn't wrong. Us
I
gamers
know.
love to get screwed over now.
I know we actually covered the Lost Levels in an episode recently, so go check it out in our archives if you'd like to learn about it, because we also discussed Mario All-Stars as part of that episode.
Yeah, we did. And, there's also 3D All Stars. So, pretty great thing it started there. Back to July 14th,
Absolutely.
1993.
Absolutely.
Next up, on July 17th, 1997, Everybody's Golf was released for the PlayStation in Japan, developed by Camelot Software Planning and published by Sony Computer Entertainment. Known in America as Hot Shots Golf, it took the golf simulation genre and wrapped it in cartoonish, big-headed characters and a simple, timing-based swing system built around just a few button presses. It became a massive success in Japan, selling over 1 million copies by the end of the year, and launched a franchise that Sony would keep alive for the next 2 decades, long after Camelot itself moved on to develop the Mario Golf series for Nintendo. I remember we used to play that. You'd come here when you were still living in Michigan.
Hot Shots Golf. I love Hot Shots
I think
Golf.
it's back in the day when your buddy Matt with the Mustang.
Yep. Yeah, I love Hot Shots Golf. I miss that sometimes. There's just something about it that's so much fun. It has all of the, like, it's a golf simulation game. It's just wrapped in so much fun, whimsy. Doesn't take itself serious, and that's fantastic.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a good one, and I think that that's why it's fun to play those cartoony golf games.
Yeah, they're still making the series. It's on like 6, I think. So we should try them.
Yeah, I agree. I'm down for it. Speaking of games to try, July 15th, 1999, Legend of Mana was released for the PlayStation in Japan, developed and published by Square. A spin-off of the Mana series rather than a numbered entry, it handed players an unusual degree of control over the world itself, letting them shape the land of Fadil by placing artifacts that generated new towns, dungeons, and storylines out of order rather than along a fixed plot. It sold roughly 700,000 copies by the end of 1999, and while contemporary critics found its lack of a clear central story disjointed, its hand-drawn visuals and Yoko Shimomura's soundtrack earned it a lasting cult following, one strong enough to justify a full remaster more than 20 years later.
I think this is one of the, like, we were talking about the Mana series recently, and I'm pretty sure this is the one we talked about. I don't think I ever realized it was a spinoff though, because this is a PlayStation Mana one, and I'm pretty sure we have this one.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, for sure. I think that was the one I remember playing.
What else we got?
Well, next, on July 18th, 2003, Pokemon Channel was released for the GameCube in Japan, developed by Umbrella and published by the Pokemon Company. A spiritual successor to Hey You Pikachu, It dropped the demands of catching and battling entirely in favor of something closer to a digital pet simulator, letting players watch in universe television programs alongside a Pikachu while helping Professor Oak track down missing broadcast segments. It played out in real time over roughly a week, a strange, quiet detour for a franchise otherwise built around constant conflict.
Did you ever play Pokemon Channel?
No, that one I did not.
It's so interesting because it literally has a 5-part anime series that has never been released anywhere else. Like, of course, honestly, you can't even really find it on YouTube. It's got like 10-second clips of it on YouTube, but anytime someone tries to um, post anything more, it gets copyright strike. So really, the only way to find this series, the specific anime, is by playing the Pokemon Channel game on GameCube, which is a fun little Pokemon fact.
Yeah, Dave, that's pretty crazy. I didn't really know that was a thing, and now I'm interested. Maybe I'll be able to find a copy.
You should look for it.
Indeed, I will. Last up for this week in gaming history, on July 13th, 2006, Persona 3 was released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan, developed and published by Atlas. Directed by series newcomer Katsura Hashino, it reshaped the Persona series around a new structure entirely, splitting time between dungeon crawling inside a shifting tower called Tartarus and an entirely separate daily life at school, where relationships built through the new social link system fed directly back into combat strength. It would go on to be remembered as one of the most influential Japanese role playing games of its generation, redefining what the series, and to some extent the genre itself, was capable of.
Persona 3 is very much when that series pushed itself into mainstream. That's the one. 4 and 5 were more popular, but 3 is the first one that really broke into it. And they're all really great games. They keep remaking. They've redone. It's Persona 3 Golden. If you ever want to get into the series, they have remade them, modern versions, and the Persona series are excellent if you like weird stuff, because I like weird stuff. So
Yeah, and if you want to learn where the Persona series came from, you can find something in the archives for a game called Shin Megami Tensei.
that's exactly right. Didn't we do a Persona episode too?
I think we might have talked Shin Megami Tensei because of Persona, but now I'm not sure.
I feel like we've done both.
Maybe you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can go find them in the archives because clearly Dave and I forgot to do our research.
My bad. I'm not perfect. I've been busy this week. It's been a busy week.
Well, Dave, it was because you had to research another topic, which is today's topic. So, with that, why don't we get into it?
The story of alternate reality, the city, begins in a way with a stolen login. Philip Price had started writing games when he was 7 years old, making up board games and outdoor games and taking his sister to play them with him. That's what they did as kids. He was really headed towards a very different life. As a freshman in high school, he planned on becoming a physician, but during a summer course called Model UN Nations, he wandered into the career center across the hall while he was on a break, and then he watched another student type a login into a computer in order to play tic-tac-toe. And once that student left, Philip sat down and typed the same sequence himself, not realizing that he was logging into someone else's account. And that's the moment he said that computers really hooked him, when he kind of felt that was a liked the feeling of that situation in various ways, that the hacker, so to speak. So he talked to school into letting a freshman, him, take courses that were normally reserved for juniors and seniors. He burned through programming languages like BASIC and Fortran and COBOL, and at somewhere in there he wrote his first program. It was a multiplayer game called Star Wars, specifically because he didn't want it to call it Star Trek. Months later, an actual movie came out with the title Star Wars, and every kid at school who had already played his game complained that it had nothing to do with it. He graduated at 16 and he enrolled at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. In his first month there, he wrote a multiplayer war game on the university's Honeywell Multics system that was built around Cold War tension. That program got popular enough that a fellow student complained that the computer room was too noisy past midnight for him to finish his own assignments. And so the university responded and banned that game from the system entirely. Price then moved his game to another account that he says a dean cleared him to use. But the university disagreed, and this situation escalated all the way into an honor court case at school, with prosecutors reportedly considering criminal charges for misuse of state funds. The prosecutor, by his own account, told Philip, "At first, I thought you were just a computer hacker. After talking with you, I realized you're instead a computer genius." In the end, it all blew over. Price was given disciplinary probation. He ended up joining the Navy afterwards out of what he's described as boredom and disillusionment. He became an nuclear reactor operator despite wanting to stay in computing. After his service, Price moved to Hawaii to live with his mother and stepfather. Within 2 months, his stepfather told him that he had overstayed his welcome and he needed to leave. Somewhere in here, he found a computer dealer selling Atari 400s and 800s and talked his way into an Atari 400 with no technical manuals to work from. And from there, he started reverse engineering the machine's hardware from scratch, mapping chip registers by trial and error, while the dealer actually was reading him magazine excerpts over the phone. Kind of complicated. Eventually, Price was living in a shack that the owner, the dealer, owned, right? Deep in Hawaiian backwoods. It had no running water. Electricity came from a Jeep they had parked outside. He and whomever else was around would go to the beach to shower with a bar of soap and some swim trunks. It was, honestly, it sounds like a fantastic lifestyle.
Yeah.
It was at that same computer dealer shop that Price met Gary Gilbertson, a Juilliard graduate who had played in what Price has called the second most popular band in Hawaii in the early 70s. They called it, they hit it off immediately, both as collaborators and as friends, and agreed early on to split everything 50-50. Price has said that he wanted an equal partnership, not one where either of them felt like the lesser half of a venture. Price's first commercial game came out of necessity as much as ambition, right? With only 32 kilobytes of memory and no floppy drive to work with, he decided that an action game was the only realistic option. And so he built a game called The Tale of Betalyre, which was a side scrolling shooter that used a probability engine to generate the terrain and enemies on the fly. Price didn't want a game that rewarded pure memorization. He didn't want to reward players who simply learned where everything was placed. So he built unpredictability into the programming and even had the game change over time the longer someone owned it. The name, The Tale of Betalyre, came from Prince's fondness for binary star systems, paired with Gilbertson's discovery of an actual binary system by that name in one of his books. The word tail was a pun. In the title, it's spelled Tail, but it can also obviously be tail as in Tale. And that was its meaning, right? It was both the story being told and a lifelong, a literal trailing debris field that was being pulled apart by the gravity of two suns in this binary system. Price and Gilbertson would drive to Los Angeles, and they sold their first game door to door to dealers themselves. Some wouldn't touch it once they learned that Price had built in copy protection that defeated the piracy hardware of the day, since those stores tended to profit from just having like one copy in circulation. But others
That's
did.
fucked.
I know.
Stores doing piracy?
I mean, hey, they would only need to buy one copy, and then they could just make copies themselves and not have to keep paying these dealers for it. It was shitty, but it happened by shady stores, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair.
Eventually, they signed with a publisher called Datasoft. It wasn't a clean start. Price had said that Datamost's royalty statement simply didn't add up, and that the company may not have been entirely honest with them. Price's next idea was originally a science fiction concept, tentatively titled The Face of the Galaxy. Partway through developing it, he realized that a fantasy setting would give him more flexibility for what he actually wanted to build. What Price wanted was a game that worked the way a good book did, pulling you into a fully realized world using nothing but words, except he wanted to do that not with words, obviously, but with sight and sound. So once Price pivoted away from science fiction and towards this fantasy setting, the shape of the whole project, he said, came into focus for him. And what he realized then was that it was never meant to be one game. In his own words, later written out for fans who had been asking for years what the full picture was supposed to look like, the idea behind our topic, alternate reality, was to build a place to entertain yourself, but also to enlighten and educate yourself. He wanted a world as realistic as possible, filled with the unknown, and he knew from the outset that no single product could hold it. And so he planned right from the beginning to develop it as a series. The first chapter, which he conceived as one unified piece before it was eventually split, dropped the player into a new environment with nothing but survival instincts to rely on. Learning to read the world, you'd have free will, uh, respected completely with monsters and people reacting to your own moral choices. There would be physical traps and mental traps and moral traps all lay side by side, multiple ways through every problem. He had big ideas, and scattered through it all were these just the first very thin clues towards why any of this was happening at all. Now that first chapter, which is at the time City and Dungeon, was conceived as one continuous descent. The city streets were above, the dungeon was whatever waited underneath. After that, there was a plan for a chapter called Arena. Your character, already established in the world, could now be forced or recruited into gladiatorial combat. You'd fight other players, you'd fight the computer's own players. If you were a captive when you were entered into the arena, obviously freedom was the goal. If you were already free, then the goal would become nobility, a title, standing in the world. You would reach the top, and you'd be given the option to retire and put that character into a life of luxury. And as Price put it, boredom, so to speak. But then he came up with the concept for Lily the Palace. If you got into luxury, there would be court intrigue, the ability to actually reshape the city itself. You could climb a ladder of power and responsibility with real consequences either way that you chose to wield it. Reach the very top, and you could depose the current king, which could be human or computer controlled, and take the throne. But once you did that, the seat wouldn't stay empty for the next player either. It was just constant give and take. Then he conceived of a chapter called The Wilderness, the start of a pilgrimage. The search for these truth, these little tidbits had been like being planted the whole time about this world was supposed to be. And so there was supposed to be a search for this truth that had been underlying the entire premise the whole time. It was going to be laced with traps and diversions that were all designed to pull the player off of the true path. After that, there would be the revelation. Hidden behind a waterfall, visible from the city itself, there would be a metal door requiring a pass card that would open into this corridor of alien technology. And eventually, a chamber would be there with windows looking out into open space. So you'd find out in Revelation that your medieval world was just an illusion, and that illusion would start to crack when you got to the revelation. And that would give way to what he conceived eventually as the last chapter, which is called Destiny. So you would go deeper into the ship, right? And there he would find a chamber full of metal cocoons, and he would learn what they actually were. Where every human that had been abducted, which was part of the story, were still physically alive and intact in these cocoons, kept that way by machines that were feeding this constant stream of images uh, in their mind. And so essentially, the implication is that your whole experience, being kidnapped, the whole city, all of it had been that just an image, a feed. Your real body the whole time would be lying in a cocoon and you just stumbled across it as part of the illusion.
So you're telling me it's a game where
The
you're in a
Matrix.
thing that makes you see a medieval world?
Yep, but you're not actually in a medieval world.
Hmm.
It'd be
Assassin's
like if you
Creed
were
could
if
never.
it right. It'd be like I was gonna say it'd be like if you were in Skyrim and then at one point you just woke up and you were actually like, you know, in one of those Matrix gel bubbles, learned that you had been just living in the Matrix, but it was Skyrim the whole time.
Yeah.
Assassin's Creed's right, but remember, we're in 1985. We're earlier than that because the game came out in 1985. So
Oh,
we're
I
in the
know.
early 80s, and this guy is conceiving this big elaborate world that is now more common.
No, I just think it's hilarious hearing that. It's like, oh, hey, that trope is still a thing now.
Very much alive now. Once you got to the end, Price wanted the ending to be a genuine weighted choice rather than a single scripted finish. So you could stay inside the illusion, effectively immortal, knowing that your captors could watch and feel everything that you did since you're now their entertainment. Or you could cut off that channel, knowing that if you do, it might mean that aliens could possibly destroy you, your ship, or Earth itself. There would be the option to escape home in a smaller vessel, bring the entire alien entertainment world back to Earth for study, destroy the planet outright, try to blackmail your captors, sell out humanity entirely. There was this whole like choose your own adventure branch style thing that he wrote out where each branch would have its own consequences.
Nice.
And that's kind of the shape of the thing that Price had set out to build in this planning stage. He wasn't looking at building a role playing game with two installments and an unfinished feeling. He was trying to present a single sustained argument about free will and captivity and what's real told across a handful of chapters. So once planned, Price had to get to work making it, and the reality is that he had never really studied 3D graphics academically, but he knew that's how he wanted to present this world. So he didn't even know the standard techniques of the field, didn't know their names, didn't know anything. So he ended up just reinventing much of it from scratch, teaching himself as he went along. What he ended up building, without knowing the term for it at the time, was a form of what we call Z buffer rendering. It's just using self-modifying code to handle the incremental like texture mapping in real time. And so he had to do all these tricks with the CPU and what we call cycle counts that would allow the hardware sprites to appear in two places on screen at once. So he was essentially like tricking it, moving things so fast, it'd be one, then the other one, one and the other, one and the other, moving it so fast. So we perceived it as one at the same time, and it let him get a lot more out of it and develop a 3D look on a computer that definitely didn't have the ability to do so.
Hmm, that's pretty
All of
neat.
all of this is running on an Atari computer that's clocked under 2 megahertz, and there are 48 kilobytes of RAM to do all of this. It's nuts. Underneath the graphics, Price was simulating things that no other game of the era touched, right? Things like a character's blood alcohol level, disease incubation periods, neuro and blood poisoning ticking away in the background, whether our player noticed them or not. He has later come and said that the hard part wasn't tracking those numbers, it was making them feel real, right? How could you convey a drunk character's reaction time as it actually degraded, right? The screen would wobble, you'd eventually black out. We've seen it in other games, but remember, 1980s, right?
Yeah.
Price has spoken out about enjoying his cinematic opening the most. It's a movie style introduction with panning shots and audio synced directly to video playing on the screen. Most of the ports to other platforms ended up cutting that sequence down for the most part, since like the Apple II and Commodore couldn't reproduce what the Atari could do natively. And then the finished game was kind of cool. It displayed 63 colors on screen simultaneously. Uh, most of the games at the time only could really show you 8 colors, so it ran more than 4 channels of sound on a sound engine that Price built himself. It was just technologically, it was so leaps and bounds above a lot of other games by a programmer that had taught himself how to do absolutely everything.
That's pretty damn impressive.
Now, we don't know this game, right? I mean, I've never heard of it. Have you ever heard of it?
Not a lick, Dave. Not at all. No knowledge.
And to be honest with you, there's not a lot out there on it. And the stuff that's out there on it is muddy. Um, there's a website dedicated to a later version of this game. They were going to turn it into an internet game. That's where a lot of this information comes from. It's an FAQ written by someone else that's compiled interviews and asked Philip Price, for instance. There's a Philip Price interview. So this is where a lot comes from. And when you stack that up against like Wikipedia, I found a Computer Gaming World article. Things kind of from here get a little muddy. Just going to be honest with you. Um, the Price says that he originally built City and Dungeon as one unified game under a company called Marston Systems, and it was Marston who demanded a fast turnaround and split them up before a company called Datasoft would inherit it and like take over the project. Price in later interviews never mentions Marston Systems at all. So early interview says Marston, later interview never says Marston. He kind of has said that City and Dungeon were split up so fast that Datasoft's own programmers, um, it was split up fast so Datasoft's own programmers could get the game on the store shelves for Christmas. Um, both tellings kind of agree on what happened. That one game, the City and Dungeon, became 2 separate games, the City and the Dungeon. They kind of they all simply disagree on who made that call and why. It gets really confusing when you try to figure it. A lot of discrepancies in it. What we do know is that the deal that Price signed with Datasoft as publisher of the game looked really simple on paper. Datasoft would publish the City and the Dungeon, and in exchange, Price and Gilbertson, as the creators, would receive a share of the profits once the cost of materials and the cost of Datasoft's own porting programmers had been subtracted first. And so, in practice, what this means is that Datasoft could charge the full cost of every single port, right? And it ended up on the Apple II, the Commodore 64, the Atari ST, the Amiga, the Macintosh. All of that, the cost of making those would be billed to Price and Gilbertson's 7.5% cut of the net profits on the game.
Wow.
And in all honesty, converting the city to each new platform took Datasoft longer than it had taken Price to write the original game in the first place. So admittedly, they weren't getting money, right? They signed a
Yeah.
contract. They signed a contract that wasn't beneficial to them. Now the rights were supposed to revert back to Price once Datasoft stopped publishing, or after 10 years, whichever came first. But he said that somewhere along the way, it was so obvious that he was never going to make any money. Right? Datasoft kept sending him advances, just enough to keep him working, keep him fed, even, but that was never what the arrangement was supposed to be. He was never going to make money, right? At some
Right.
point, at some point, Datasoft's president asked him directly, "Is it the money? We can
What do
work
you
something
think?
out, right? We can work something out if it is." And Price said, "Yeah, it's the money." He was living on less than $15,000 a year while he had a game out there that was supposedly making millions for Datasoft. I don't know about that number, but that's the point.
Either way, still not good. No bueno.
But Price has also in other interviews been clear that it wasn't only about the paycheck, right? What actually drove him out in the end, he has said, was losing faith that the business would ever deal fairly with the people who made the products in the first place. And we've seen this before, right? This is the time period when Atari famously had their falling out with their programmers because they didn't want to pay them correctly, royalties, and they didn't want to give them credit. And so, they started to leave, and Activision was founded, and we got all these third party, developers at this point, right?
Right.
So this is just kind of where the industry was at this point, and Price was no different than where the rest of the industry was. Somewhere in the middle of this argument, though, Price had begun coding the dungeon, right? The city he gave to Datasoft, and they took it and they released it, and then they had this money dispute. But again, like, there was a whole series here. So he didn't give up. He started to code the dungeon, working from his original concept. That version, which he says was roughly half finished, was lost when he finally made the decision to leave the industry entirely and find income elsewhere. He had left his notes and his design behind. What survived wasn't so much code as it was just a scaffolding around it, right? Conceptual documents and handwritten notes that Gary had taken during these questioning, Q&A sessions that he had with Price, because he was trying to capture as much of the original vision as could be carried forward by someone else. So, Price left, and someone else was there to pick up the pieces. Rob, thinking about Philip Price losing half a finished dungeon because he had to walk away and find income elsewhere, it really puts things into perspective. Losing your work because life got in the way is a nightmare that no creator should have to go through.
No backup plan, no safety net. Just gone.
Exactly. And that's a big part of why I trust Zencaster with everything we record. It's an all in one podcasting platform built so you never lose your work, no matter what happens mid session.
But what happens if the connection drops halfway through an episode?
Well, that's the beauty of it, right? Zencaster records locally in the highest quality available and backs everything up as you go. Even if the internet cuts out, your audio and video are still safe.
So there's no 18 months spent trying to reconstruct someone else's half finished work.
None at all. And once we're done recording, Zencaster's post production tools clean up background noise, trim filler words, and balance the audio automatically. There is no reverse engineering required.
And what about getting it out to the world?
One dashboard. So easy. Zencaster distributes the show straight to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else you can find us. There is no lost royalties, no disappearing contracts, just your work reaching its people.
So basically, the opposite of what happened to Philip Price.
Pretty much. And if you would like to start a podcast with ease, head over to zencaster.com/pricing. Use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan.
No shack in the Hawaiian backwoods required.
None whatsoever. Go over to Zencaster/pricing. Use our code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off your first month.
All right, Dave. So after all that, did alternate reality ever get its due?
Well, with Price gone, Datasoft turned the unfinished project over to its own staff, right? Ken Jordan was already an established programmer there, having ported a game called Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom and Tapper, which we've done an episode on, to Atari Systems as part of Datasoft. Dan Penal was newer. He really doesn't have any documented credits before this project, but together they were handed what Price had left behind, right? But as we know, what they inherited wasn't a finished game. It was Price's original concept, along with handwritten transcriptions of hours of a conversation between Gilbertson and Price, and then whatever scraps of design documentation had survived the rest of the situation. Both these men were Datasoft employees, but by this point, again, more money. By this point, the company supposedly was operating under the name IntelliCreations. Uh, Whichever it was, Datasoft or IntelliCreations, they were working on this game and working from that foundation. It took them roughly 18 months to bring the dungeon to release. They kept on Gary Gilbertson for the music. Gary was composing from Hawaii, while Jordan and Penal worked on the game on the mainland. They brought in an in-house Datasoft artist called Bonita Long Hemseth, who handled the graphics. Hemseth would later go on to become an art director on the Might and Magic series. So you have all these people working together. Jordan and Penal made some real design choices of their own rather than simply than just executing, Price's leftover notes. They introduced weight as a governing mechanic. Every item in the dungeon, even money, now had physical heft. Kind of common for role playing games now, like Skyrim, since we keep talking about it. Wasn't always the case.
True.
And of course, along with that, when you carry too much weight, that would slow a character down or immobilize them outright if they were over encumbered. Where the city had just one rigid, unchangeable moral alignment, the dungeon allowed for something closer to redemption. It was a more forgiving system where good and evil weren't fixed the moment you crossed the line. As part of the dungeon, they also built a concept called guild rivalries, rivalries with obviously other characters, other players. They built into something closer to like an actual conflict. These were factions that were at war with one another in the underground. Each would have their own allies and enemies kind of baked directly into the world. So they did more with the world building, right?
Yeah.
Price has, in retrospect, described their choice to keep his engine and the visual identity of his original work while restructuring the systems underneath as mostly successful. Though he kind of there's a split of labor now, right? The finished dungeon now has both their fingerprint and his. It's basically his original vision filtered through 18 months of two other people, kind of finishing his argument.
Hmm.
The dungeon ships in 1987, first for the Atari 8-bit that the city was originally built for, and then eventually with a Commodore 64 and Apple II port. So now we have two games out of what was planned as 6 or 7. By the time the dungeon shipped, the ground underneath the whole project was kind of already shifting, right? Datasoft went bankrupt in 1987. Two of the company's own executives, Samuel Poole and Ted Hoffman, bought up the company's remaining assets and they relaunched it as IntelliCreations. So again, kind of unclear whether or not it was Datasoft or IntelliCreations. There's an interview with the game's creators, Price and Gilbertson, that says the buyout was done by an outside company called Software Toolworks. So I don't know where that came from. I couldn't find any note of that in like the independent business history of Datasoft. So really all we have is the company's executives noting that Datasoft became IntelliCreations. But again, a lot of really discrepancies when you dig into all of this. The game's creators are being interviewed and they have a very different perspective on what's going on. And honestly, what that tells me is they probably didn't know, right? Like, if their perception is that a company called Software Toolworks is buying out Datasoft, but the reality is Datasoft is becoming IntelliCreations, they probably weren't in that loop. And so their memory of everything is just what they knew at the time. Whether or not it's correct or not, it's their reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair.
Whoever was actually in charge, the outcome was the same. Jordan and Penal were working from home without an office to report to on ports of the dungeon. They reportedly got to about 70% complete before the work on any ports was just stopped. At that point, plans for the third installment, Arena, had already been outlined, um, and never moved past the outline phase, right? So that's that. And then everything gets even fuzzier. In 1988, word got around, apparently starting with Price himself, that the dungeon would be the last alternate reality game ever released. Datasoft's president, Samuel Poole, denied it publicly in an interview with Computer Gaming World. An actual article I found. He called the claim false, said he hadn't spoken with Price in over a year, and insisted that Arena was designed and ready to go, with the only potential interference being from Price and Gilbertson's own company, Paradise Programming, which still held the licensing rights. That's literally in the Computer Gaming World article. And so you have two men, both with something to lose, telling two different stories about who killed the series. Price saying it's already dead, and Poole saying it's alive, and that Price himself is the only one standing in the way. Whichever version was closer to the truth in 1988, the outcome by any account was the same. Arena was simply, as far as we know, never programmed. The rest of the versions, Palace, Wilderness, Revelation, and Destiny, never moved past the outline phase that Price had written years earlier. 2 games shipped, 5 or 6, depending on how you count the City and Dungeon, kind of never did. And then again, years later in the late 90s, Price tried once more. He planned a massively multiplayer version of alternate reality, partnering up with a studio called Monolith Productions. That attempt also collapsed, reportedly overfunding, before Monolith moved on to other projects entirely. The details for that one is thinner that than the rest of what we gathered. So that's that. It Not a lot out there. Now, contemporary reviewers were genuinely split on what Price had built, to be fair. Dragon Magazine's feature review gave the city 3 out of 5 stars and the dungeon 2.5. The British magazine, Computer Gamer, went the other direction, kind of giving the city a full 5 out of 5 for the value, best bang for your buck type deal. Computer Gaming World's own buyer's guide, which was published in late 1987, judged the dungeon's design and mechanics as superior to what Price had built in the city. One of those rare cases where critics had agreed that a sequel had improved on the original. The magazine's own critic, Computer Gaming World's critic, writing under the name Scorpia, reviewed the dungeon on its release and called it a big improvement, right? But noted too that it was ultimately unsatisfying. She praised the graphics, the technical prowess, but said that the game lacked any real sense of accomplishment. Starting a character from nothing, she found was nearly impossible, and there were several systems that they added that just kind of felt like they punished players arbitrarily. There was an unbeatable creature called the Devourer that simply ate your possessions once you were carrying too much. Years later, while looking back at both games, Scorpia, in a different review, was blunter still. She called the city a fascinating premise that turned out rather poorly, a game she wrote for those with great persistence and patience. The dungeon, in her final judgment, was better than the first, but not by much. What almost all of those reviewers fully reckoned with at the time or since was what Price had actually been trying to build underneath it all. Not a dungeon crawler with an unusually elaborate skin. He had laid out an entire argument about captivity and free will distributed across 6 or 7 games, depending on the account. And unfortunately, we only ever got to see 2 of those games, which is sad.
That is pretty sad, Dave.
Womp womp.
But hey, that Devourer is pretty cool.
I know, cool concept. If today's episode left you thinking about games that tried to build an entire living world instead of just levels to clear, we've got a few episodes already in the archive we're checking out. Episode 106 tells the story of Wizardry, a game that arrived in the same era of role playing games as alternate reality, but took the genre in an almost opposite direction. Brutal, minimal, unforgiving, worth comparing side by side to what Philip Price was trying to build. Episode 127 covers Sword Quest, another product of that same wild, ambitious, occasionally overreaching Atari era, a project whose promises ended up outrunning what actually made it into players' hands. Also, Pimp Cup. Love me a Pimp Cup.
Love the Pimp Cup.
And episode 189 dives into Amnesia from 1986, a game that shares something real with alternate reality. An obsession by its creator with making its world feel inhabited, lived in, and alive rather than a backdrop for combat. You can find these episodes, of course, and more at our archives, which can be found on our website, www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can listeners find when they head to our site?
You can find our future episode topics, know what we'll be talking about in the upcoming weeks and months. You can find a link to our Discord channel where you can chat with Dave and I. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I can be found on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor. And Dave?
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It could be about a game, a platform, a person, a technology, a console. We've covered places before, events. We do it all. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's a fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning. And in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, Dave, I think that it's another one of those, it's mind-blowing what people are able to accomplish when they put their mind to it, where this guy taught himself how to do everything. Price taught himself how to code everything, create everything, the Z buffer rendering, and able to do it all on an Atari computer that was not very technologically advanced. And it's kind of shitty that he didn't get paid so good for it.
It is.
It's the dungeon was an improvement, but would it have been even better if he'd been paid and wanted to put more effort into the game? It's one of those always what ifs that we look at, and who knows, maybe the series may have gotten more of what it was supposed to if that happened, but you'll never know.
I agree. I think it's really fascinating that he was doing Z buffer, working with the Z buffering that early. Z buffering is pretty much embedded into all modern GPUs for real time 3D rendering. And I mean, he wasn't doing it with any, he was doing it. That's it. He's doing it.
Yeah.
The fact that he was able to, do depth to buffer with depth and kind of somewhat make 3D graphics on Atari is just, it's really impressive.
Yeah, and figuring it out on his own is even more impressive in my book.
I agree. Absolutely agree.
So that's my big takeaway. What about yourself?
Um, I don't know, man. This one was kind of frustrating. Anytime I try to dig into the story, I just hit walls. Like the whole Datasoft becoming IntelliCreations, becoming software to like it, and at one point, like he said that we worked for a company called Data Most, which is different from Datasoft. Like it just is a kind of a mess. The Philip Price's memory of everything muddies everything up. And he made this game and then he left the industry, and pretty much every part of the industry he was a part of was gone shortly thereafter. So it's not like there's people that have been around for, like, you know how we deal with lineages, and then what happens a lot is when you make newer games, people interview you about your old games and you start to fill in the pieces. But this story exists in the 80s. It exists in the 90s because of the internet one, but like that's it. Like you have late mid 80s into late 80s into early 90s, and then just gone. All of it's gone. Price goes elsewhere. Datasoft is gone. Like it's just gone. And it's a mess, man, but it was fun to try to figure it out at one point, because normally I'm good about finding things that muddy the water, but it was so bad at one point I just decided to take the approach I did and say, look, I can't figure it out. So we're going to talk about that,
Hey, fair enough.
because I
Sometimes it's
think
all you can do.
right. I think I think the misremembering and the muddy part is as much part of the history for this one as anything else. So all right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of this week and into next week, is there anything else you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. We love having you here. We hope you enjoy learning, even when we're not able to figure out a lot about the story. We still have fun, and we hope that you do too. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, indeed. Philip Price wanted to build a world that argued with you. Not a fantasy that let you win by memorizing patterns and grinding levels, but one that noticed what you did and asked quietly whether you meant to do it. It was a city that didn't care if you had a destiny, a series that was supposed to patch itself game by game into something that only revealed its full shape once every piece existed. But only two pieces ever did. But he was brilliant with those two pieces, built them on a machine with less memory than a single modern photograph, reinventing 3D rendering because nobody had taught him the proper way to do it, right? And then a contract just quietly took that all away from him. Not through some dramatic betrayal, just this slow arithmetic of costs subtracted before profits year after year until there was nothing to subtract it from. So he left. Two other men picked up what he left behind. They finished it as best as they could, working from notes and scraps left from it. And then that ended too, you know. Um, in a dispute that nobody agrees on, where we don't know who actually killed the thing and why. What's left is a game about being kidnapped, about discovering your captors who have made you their entertainment, and about deciding in the end what you owe to a reality you never chose. Philip Price never really got to finish telling that story, but for a moment, on an Atari computer in the backwoods of Hawaii, he did get to start it. Next week, we are trading a broken vision of aliens in Hawaii for something much quieter and much darker. In 2010, a small Danish studio called Playdead released a game with almost no color at all. It's a boy alone in a monochrome forest, searching for his sister with barely a word of explanation for any of it. Limbo didn't need dialogue or a tutorial or a story even that you could summarize. It just needed what it has: silhouettes, sound, and the sense that something terrible is always one step behind you. So join us next week as we explore the game that proves that atmosphere alone could carry an entire experience, as we take yet another trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.